You are listening to Fruitless, a podcast hosted by me, Josiah Sutton. This is episode 8, Christ and the Queer Apocalypse, featuring Keanu Heydari. Start here and say welcome everybody to Fruitless. I am joined today by Keanu here, who has been wonderfully nice enough to join and agree to join and talk about queer theory and theology. So why don't you introduce yourself real quick for those who don't know you?
Hello everyone, my name is Keanu Heydari. I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. My dissertation looks at Iranian student activism in the second half of the 20th century in Paris, but I'm broadly interested in questions of New Testament theology, critical theory, gender studies, queer theory as well. Yeah, absolutely. Which that would be that'd be great to have you on another time to talk about the Iranian activism and stuff like that at some point. But I guess we'll be moving away from your actual PhD topic here to more broadly a lot of this queer scholarship that you've been spending some time diving into, and just asking why Christians, especially Christians of the liberation kind of bent, should care about it. So I guess why don't you kind of introduce, for those who aren't really very familiar with queer theory and critical queer theory, what is it and what is it trying to do? Basically, since the sexual liberation movement that began in the 1960s across the Western world, there's been a increasing degree of specialization of focus in terms of asking questions critical about gender and sexuality. We began during the AIDS crisis in the 70s and 80s with the gay rights movement, the gay and lesbian rights movement, and moving towards the 90s and the early aughts, we have an evolution of what we can call queer theory. Basically, the best way I can describe this transformation between gay rights and queer theory is to think through the transition between what can be called feminist standpoint theory and what we today call intersectionality. So feminist standpoint theory has been criticized for being overly essentialist. It essentially argues that the epistemic perspective of someone who is a woman or someone who is a person of color occupies a unique standpoint from which no other perspective can speak to. And this perspective of standpoint has been criticized as being essentialist because we started to ask questions in the 80s and 90s about, well, what does it really mean to be a woman? What does it really mean to be a man? And once we started asking these broader ontological questions, we got to a point where we began to destabilize the very assumptions that first and second wave feminism were built on. Namely, that there is something self-evidently clear of what a woman is. There's something self-evidently clear of what a man is. And once we got to a point where we started questioning these fundamental assumptions, we entered the realm of what we can today call third wave feminism.
So for a listener who maybe isn't familiar with, and maybe is kind of confused by the recent wave of kind of gender conversations that have become more mainstreamed, what is the questioning behind what makes it not so apparent that somebody's a woman or a man fits into that binary?
So Gail Rubin, the anthropologist at the University of Michigan, has an essay that I believe was their bachelor's degree thesis. I could be wrong. But it was an essay on the sex and gender system. And it basically said that there is a distinction between one's biological sex, or sex that is assigned at birth, and their gender, namely the roles of masculinity and femininity that are performed in day-to-day life. In his oeuvre, in his works, Michel Foucault's first volume of the History of Sexuality went even further than what Rubin stipulated in this thesis on the sex and gender system, and actually argued that sex as we understand it is not some transcendental historical a priori. It's not that people have always been having sex, and whatever comes after, like sexuality or gender, is a product of it. He actually makes the very provocative argument that it's actually the reverse. Sex is a product of sexuality. Sex as we understand it today, not the act of coitus in general, but sex as we understand it today as this behavior between two adults or what have you, is actually itself a product of sexuality that comes out of the 18th century. What the French call the classical age, or the classical period, which corresponds to our early modern period.
Gotcha.
So
okay.
once we get to a point where we're questioning the very foundations of the relationship between sex and gender, the historical chronology that we've had for so long begins to be destabilized as well. So if our very chronology is destabilized, meaning, well, what is the order of events? Is it that Adam and Eve were created in a garden however many thousands of years ago, and that's heterosexual heteronormativity, that's how God intended it, and sucks to suck if you don't fall into that paradigm? What this historical scholarship has done is to say, no, what was going on in the minds of people who wrote Genesis down, something along the lines of the second millennium BC, that epistemology of gender is very different than our modern conceptions of gender and sexuality today.
Okay. Yeah, so that's great that we're already kind of introducing the theological aspect to this here. So what does the scholarship point to with Genesis? Like what does the scholarship point to, like how different the view of sexuality or gender would have been to that 2000 BCE context?
I guess, while I can't necessarily speak very coherently about the positive ontological aspects of what people believed 2,000 years ago, what I can tell you is that somewhere in the 18th century, we have an explosion of discourse about sex. And this explosion of discourse about sex goes in pretty much in the face of what we traditionally tell ourselves about the history of sexuality. This is what Foucault calls the repressive hypothesis.
Yeah. This is the subject of the first volume, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
And just for your listeners, just to recapitulate this very briefly, the repressive hypothesis is the idea that somewhere in the Victorian period, we got really stuffy about sex. And the way we can liberate ourselves is by talking more about sex.
Yeah.
What Foucault did is to show that we've been talking about sex incessantly for the past several hundred years. And we haven't gotten any freer as a result of it.
No.
If we combine these two threads, one thread that says, in the 18th century, a new discourse about sex began to emerge that was concerned with the control of populations, with the healthy, normative, reproductive family. We combine that thread with another thread that says, regardless of what people in the second millennium BC actually believed about gender or sex, we can be very damn sure that it has nothing to do with what we believe today about gender or sex. That it's a completely different cosmological universe. That it's a completely different ground of thinking. Once we combine these two threads, I would say the church is confronted with a very unpleasant and startling provocation.
Yeah.
Namely, everything we think we know about gender and sex today is historically contingent.
Yeah.
It's not this transcendental reality that we've dealt with for eons and eons. It is something that comes out of the early modern period And what do I mean when I say that? I guess in the late 19th century, people in Germany for the first time began to talk about homosexuality.
Hmm.
And it wasn't until afterwards, in the beginning of the 20th century, that we have the corresponding term heterosexuality. So the very notion that someone can have a biological or intrinsic sexual orientation arises in the late 19th century.
Yeah. Yeah. So what does that mean to somebody with before that period who would have the desire to have sex with somebody of the same sex or gender? How would they think of themselves? Or would they think of themselves?
I think there wouldn't have been a sense of sexualized subjectivity. One wouldn't go around and define themselves in terms of their identity based on their sexual preferences.
So how does queer theory kind of try to confront this fact? Does it? I know you've spoken about how there's been a social and an antisocial turn in queer theory. How do they kind of both try to address what we ought to do in light of this question?
I suppose if we're talking about the antisocial turn in queer theory, basically, in as simple terms as possible, people like Leo Bersani and Lauren Berlant, Michael Warner, Lee Edelman, they're going to talk about this concept called queer negativity, which is basically the idea that queerness, in opposition to ideas like being gay or lesbian, is not something that has positive ontological content.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is to be queer is a fundamentally relational category. You are queer in relation to something or someone else. The best example I can give about this is when I make the very provocative statement, someone can be gay but not be queer. Someone looks at me and they're going to say, that's crazy. How's that possible? Well, look at someone like Pete Buttigieg. He has completely bought into the cis heteropatriarchal normative conception of the reproductive family.
Mm-hmm.
He supports American institutions of repressive state violence like the military and the police force.
Mm-hmm.
He actively legislates in favor of those organizations and institutions, and he is an advocate of the carceral state. So he's actively utilizing his identity as a smokescreen to deflect attention from his definitely non-queer political positions.
So queerness does have to identify itself with the state in some way, it seems. The implication, or it has something to say of being in maybe not in opposition, but some sort of negation of the state function, like the way the state functions.
I would say a opposition more than just the state, an opposition to the social world as such.
Okay.
An opposition to the social world that creates the conditions of possibility that cause, gay and trans kids to have to leave their religious parents' home and to suffer the effects of isolation and bullying and alienation from their broader communities.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so that would be kind of the antisocial turn, where it's trying to identify, it's trying to see queerness as being just the category of being outside of the existing established gender hierarchy or gender structure as it exists.
Right.
And the social term, I would assume then, is kind of the opposite, where it's trying to bring queerness into that structure, make it accepted by the structure.
It goes against the radical epistemic nihilism of some modern antisocial queer theorists in terms of rejecting slogans like there's a really great slogan that I like, which is queer revolution, not mere inclusion. So
okay.
I don't know if there's actually something called the social turn, but it's people who are mainline liberal thinkers in queer theory who are advocating for greater inclusion in society.
Yeah. Okay.
Who don't find any problem with gay and trans people serving in the military.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, I think if people listening to this are more likely to, be a Christian that's affirming of gay relationships or whatever, they'll probably be more likely to fit into that camp.
Right.
And so I guess why should the church consider looking at it in more of this like revolutionary antisocial way?
I think there's multiple layers to this conversation, right? I
Sure.
think
Oh yeah.
the church has always been countercultural.
Mm-hmm.
And I think theologians who have tried to make apologies for the church have ended up falling into the trap of recapitulating dominant philosophical modes of speculation, dominant modes of thinking. So Clement and Justin Martyr and others end up creating, an echo chamber for Stoic philosophy in their writing, right? When they're coming with this really powerful polemic discourse against paganism, or really powerful polemic discourse trying to convince the Roman authorities that Christianity doesn't pose a threat to the established social order, right? I think that these writings demonstrate the pitfalls of a certain mode of Christian thinking, right? But in its inner house discourse, writings that span the gamut of the Pauline corpus to the Apostolic Fathers to the Didache, even. I would say these documents are fundamentally apocalyptic in nature.
Yeah.
What that means is that these authors are all looking towards the imminent return of Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to live in such a way as to create a radical community of people who oppose the existing social hierarchies and orders.
Mm-hmm.
And this opposition, to me, is broadly reminiscent of a lot of the commitments of queer negativity and the antisocial turn, because we're saying, whatever you've got going on, whatever this social order is that allows for poverty, for homelessness, for discrimination and racism and homophobia, this is not what the church stands for. This is not the discourse of the imminent return of Christ.
Gotcha. And so I guess why does that perspective feel still relevant today? Because, as a lot of people will kind of use that sense of imminent return of Christ to be kind of dismissive of a lot of aspects of the New Testament, where it's like, well, at the time they thought Jesus was going to be coming back in a few decades. But now here we are 2,000 years later, and it doesn't seem to have been the case. What is the argument to still take that seriously, to still kind of, even if we don't think Jesus is coming back tomorrow, to still act as if that's the case?
I think what I would say is that a non-apocalyptic Christianity is not one worth believing in. Because what we have going on is a system that acquiesces to dominant political hegemonies.
Yeah,
it's the sin of Constantinianism, right? It's acquiescing to the dominant repressive state apparatus and ideological state apparatus. It's saying, let's get in bed with the powers that be and become a tool for oppression.
Mm-hmm.
The church needs to be militantly on the vanguard of new forms of cultural expression, new forms of bridge building that bring together saints and sinners in a way that is a revolutionary paradigm for the world to imitate. And the only way we can do that is by this apocalyptic tendency, this belief that the return of God to actualize the new heavens and the new earth will inspire a form of vigilance. That without this, there's no motivation for the church to remain vigilant.
Sure. If we're taking on kind of the queer theoretical lens or whatever, we want to abolish or, fight against existing discourses about sexuality and gender and what those mean. I think that in practice, of course, I don't think most people would want kind of sexual free for all or anything. What is the kind of, is there a normative system and ethic or something that would be more in line with a Christian view with kind of your view of sexuality or gender? I think of like the few attempts I've read at that, and, I haven't read a lot of this scholarship, would be like Just Love by Margaret Farley, right? Where it was an attempt at trying to cook down kind of a like Catholic theology that's inclusive of queer people, or different forms of sexuality. However, that seems more in line with kind of the social approach to queer theory you're talking about, and not as much this apocalyptic and revolutionary approach. So I guess what would be a revolutionary sex ethic?
This is a question I've struggled with quite a bit. I think in my readings, people like Eugene Rogers in Sexuality and the Christian Body, and Douglas Campbell in his recent Pauline Dogmatics, will stay within a broadly traditional hermeneutic, and will say that, let me put my cards on the table for you. Campbell is an advocate of what we might call a supralapsarian theory of one could say justification or soteriology, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. It's at odds with the more traditional view, which we would call infralapsarian. So
Okay.
the infralapsarian position is one that you're very familiar with. It's God had a plan A, we screwed up, so Jesus comes as our plan B.
Yeah. Okay.
This is the traditional creation, fall, redemption, restoration narrative that we hear a lot in reform circles, right? Campbell repudiates this wholeheartedly and says that this is not a Christocentric worldview.
No.
Instead, he advocates the supralapsarian view, which is another way of saying incarnation anyway, which is God has had a plan A from the beginning.
Yeah.
And the plan A has always been Jesus Christ with us, for us, by us, from time immemorial to the present moment to eternity. And sin and death are cosmic forces which enter the universe and derail plan A. Jesus comes to put us back on the original plan.
Okay.
Someone might say, this seems like an academic distinction. And I'll say it's not. It's not, because a supralapsarian Christology, a supralapsarian doctrine of salvation, ultimately says Christ is the vantage point from which we have to think about all of Scripture, from which we have to think about all questions of sexual ethics, about gender. And it's not about going back to some kind of primordial doctrine of creation, about the originary states of Adam and Eve. It's about, what does Christ do in inaugurating a new creation? Now, here's the problem. Paul is a sticky figure because he doesn't always stick to this supralapsarian logic. Sometimes he switches to an infralapsarian mode of argument. And this can be found in various places where he articulates the household codes, where he talks about, women having to veil themselves going to mass, or, he uses the logic of wives be submissive to your husbands and husbands rule over your wives like Christ is the head of the church. The interesting thing about a supralapsarian reading of passages like that is that someone like Campbell will use Paul against himself. So Paul is said to be insufficiently Pauline in those passages.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And this goes to a very old German form of criticism called Sachkritik, or subject criticism, which is basically saying, what was the intention of the gospel message in this passage? And so once we get all this technical jargon on the table, we can start to see that our commitment is for an emancipatory and liberatory reading of Paul.
Okay, yeah.
So if that's the case, we can then start to think about ways of staying within a theological reading of Paul that is as faithful to the text as we can get, without recycling and reduplicating heteropatriarchy, forms of oppression, forms of, slavery even, which is discussed in the New Testament context, right? Getting away from all of these and seeing how an egalitarian Paul, a progressive Paul, is a very possible hermeneutic option.
Yeah.
And so, bottom line, people like Campbell and Rogers are going to say something to the effect of sexual promiscuity is not necessarily something that we can weasel our way out of in the New Testament context.
Mm-hmm.
We can't really make a concrete case for things like polyamory.
Right.
What we can do is say that marriage is expansive enough to include same-sex couples or transgender couples.
Okay. Yeah.
And I struggle with that because I don't know if this is an excessively confessionalist reading of the New Testament that confines me to certain kind of limits of thinking that are not as inclusive as they could be.
Mm-hmm.
But this is where I'm at this point. These are the kinds of people I'm reading, people like Rogers and Campbell, who open up the door to see that the form is separate from the content. That there is no good supralapsarian reason to prevent same-sex couples from getting married.
Right. Absolutely. No, that's a great argument. But yeah, there does appear to be kind of a tension there between that attempt to deontologize gender or sexuality, and still kind of that kind of creedal approach. How do you think that this kind of tension would play out in the church? You and I are both in the main line. I think that would be probably most likely where this discourse would happen, because I don't see the Catholic Church even getting to just the inclusive stuff anytime soon. How would this play out if mainline pastors were to try to take this seriously?
I think part of it is going to be the need to reckon with politically useful, politically pragmatic discourses. So why do transgender people have to say that they were born a certain way? They have to say that they were born a certain way because the juridico-medical establishment requires a performance of gender to receive adequate medical care.
Yeah.
They require a performance of the gender to which you actually feel yourself conforming to through these stylized forms of masculinity and femininity to receive adequate care to treat dysphoria.
Yeah.
Gay people have historically used the argument that they were born with a particular sexual orientation, not because that argument has any analytic weight to it, but because it's been the tool to achieve liberation in the public sphere.
Mm-hmm.
Because using the arguments and the logics that we have, if someone is born a certain way, there's no moral culpability for them if they choose to act on how they were born.
Yeah.
When in reality, thinkers as diverse as Foucault and Freud have proposed various explanations to how we get to where we are that don't rely on these essentialist biological paradigms of sexuality and gender.
Sure. Well, and I know the fear, we're talking about like political pragmatism here. The fear is that if you take this Freudian lens, or Foucauldian lens, and say homosexuality is a product of discourse, it's a product of certain social forces, then, the conservative reactionary kind of approach to that would be, well, then let's get rid of the social forces that produce gay people. And so the fear is that. Or like, I believe a lot of conservatives will use almost Freudian logic to say like homosexuality is the result of being abused as a child or something like that. What's the argument to still push for making this a socially constructed or looking at this in a socially constructed way? If the essentialist perspective seems to have been more politically pragmatic.
I think one is a concern for truth.
Yeah.
If we're advocating for these the non-socially constructed positions and these essentialized arguments, what we're doing is confining people to grids of intelligibility that are inherently oppressive. Yeah. Once you confine someone to an identitarian category, you basically require a performance of coming out. This is what Eve Sedgwick talks about in the epistemology of the closet, that there's a certain kind of jouissance, a certain kind of sick pleasure that heteronormative institutions and societies get from forcing queer people to come out of a closet through some kind of barbaric, ritualistic performance of almost like
Confession.
beating one's chest and saying, "I'm different. I'm a spectacle to be beholden." So once we begin to see how truly fragmented our epistemological scene is, I think we'll come to softer conclusions. Namely, we'll be more open to not being obsessed with the question of origins, but being more concerned with the question of how discourse and language shapes our experience of one another and of the social world.
Yeah.
One of my professors, David Halperin, who is at Michigan, gave this wonderful example, which is, I assume, Josiah, you're not a vegetarian, right?
No.
Do you prefer white meat chicken or dark meat chicken?
Dark meat.
Okay. You're a dark meatist. At this point, from this point forward, I'm going to define your entire identity on the basis of your arbitrary preference for a certain kind of meat. Not only am I going to do that, it's actually a secret about you. It's a secret that reveals some inner complex of trauma and abuse that you went through as a child. It reveals some kind of secret narrative that unlocks the key to making sense out of your entire childhood. You see how ridiculous this argument is.
Yeah, and I would, if I were to take on, as a dark meatist, take on that, then like there are times that I do enjoy white meat or something like that, and I would almost feel bizarre at that because I'm stepping out of this taxonomy that's kind of been applied to me. Sure.
So I think it's crucial for your listeners to hear what I'm not saying. Okay. I'm not saying that the preference for white meat or dark meat is fake.
Right.
The preference is clearly there. I'm saying it's socially meaningless.
Yeah.
It is heteronormative society that gives the social context of meaning to one's arbitrary preference.
Right.
The preference doesn't say anything about who you are as a person. It's a void. It's a negativity. It's an arbitrary accident that you happen to prefer one kind of meat over another kind of meat.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really good. Moving back to the kind of theological side to this, I know that you, from conversations we've had, you have a preference for like Calvin, for instance. Theologically, you like Calvin, and I know Calvin works a lot with Augustine, and both kind of play with some interesting ideas of like desire, and the phrase disordered desire kind of comes out of an Augustinian perspective, right? Of that there are desires put in us by God, but they can be disordered, they can be pushed toward out of the realm of virtue and into whatever. However, that seems to be kind of in conflict with the idea of social construction with this. So I guess how do you navigate that? So
Miguel de Bestegui and other thinkers have talked about the forms of sovereign power and the creation of subjects and subjectivities who become desiring beings. And this is what if I die, the one thing I want people to remember from my life is that we have to gradually remove transcendental historical a priori. What does that mean? It means we have to gradually think and gradually step away from things we assume to transcend our historical moment.
Okay.
Desire, feeling, even food has a history. Everything has a history. Nothing transcends its historical context. We have not always been desiring subjects. For example, in volumes 2 and 3, and to some extent volume 4 of the History of Sexuality talks about this, where the Stoic thinker, so to some extent even the pre-Socratic and pre-Stoic thinkers were concerned with what Foucault calls epimilia huetu, which is Greek for care of the self. It's a broadly different way of thinking, where the individual is not this divinely ordained subject that has a connection to a logos who is given a set of desires that have to be controlled by use of autonomous reason. Otherwise, they get out of hand, right?
Yeah.
The Greco-Roman perspective was, in front of you, you have a smorgasbord of worldly delights and pleasures. And you have to use your sensibilities, your cognitive faculties to discipline the different ways you can enjoy pleasure. And this model of a human being who is cultivating different pleasures, cultivating different ways of enjoying the world, is broadly different from the later Stoic mentality and the first and second century Christian discourse of this autonomous being who is under assault by irrational desires that have to be tamed. So if the narrative changes in such a short span of time until we get to the Cartesian res cogito, where you have the beginnings of a divorce between mankind and God, where now it's a man is under this autonomous control of desires that are external or internal or what have you, and these need to be controlled by discipline, right? That this discourse ultimately shows us that this is malleable, this is contingent, that desire is not something that's transparent to us.
Yeah. Going off of what you said about trying to not see any transcendent historical entities. I mean, there's kind of an obvious question to ask there, which is how do you still hold that view with belief in God or belief in Christianity broadly? Because that seems to imply something that does transcend history and influence itself in history.
This is where I bring in folks like Karl Barth, who would say that he would, in volume 1 of the Church Dogmatics, he thinks in very geometric terms. And we think of the world as a circle. And God's self-disclosure to humankind as a tangent line. A tangent line on that circle. That's the heart of apocalypticism, that God intervenes in history. It's not this panentheistic schema where God is diffuse throughout all of creation, and God interpenetrates the world, and the world interpenetrates God. It's very much in opposition to the thinking of people like David Bentley Hart and people who are broadly Neoplatonic in thinking. It's also in opposition to the thought of people like Volpart Pannenberg, right? This Barthian conception of the world is ultimately one of a world in crisis, a world trapped in its sin, in its estrangement from God, its alienation from God, who desperately seeks redemption and renewal, only to find that God comes to earth in the most unlikely place, in the most unlikely way, in a know-nothing, irrelevant part of the world, and shows himself to be the fulfillment of all our longings and desires. It's this God who radically and apocalyptically intervenes in space and time, who shows himself to be God for us, apart from whom we would have no knowledge or conception of God. So this is the broadly radical epistemic claim that's being made by Barth, which is that without Christ, the Christian story would not make sense. It sounds like like an obvious point. But
no, but it is a powerful thing that Barth pulls out here. Yeah. No, that's a great answer, because God through Christ has entered history, and so therefore, it is transcendent but also immanent. He does enter the discourse in a sense. So no, that's a great answer to that. There's something else I was going to ask. Oh, I guess I'm still trying to wrap my head around what kind of a normative ethic of sexuality would come out of a lot of this here. But I know you're saying you're torn on that question as well. So I don't know if there's quite an easy answer to it. But I guess what does Christ have to say for sexuality? Maybe is a good question to kind of move us into that conversation, because I think we're accepting a kind of Christocentric approach here.
I think ultimately Barth's main contribution to systematic theology, people normally think, it's his doctrine of election, which is in Christ, all of humanity is federally represented in Christ as the elected one, but Christ himself is the reprobated one who receives the punishment from the Father. There's another dimension of Barth's thought that people rarely invoke, which is the doctrine of command. That through the covenant, God wants us to imitate Christ by analogy, which is another way of saying that we in contradistinction to orthodox doctrines of theosis, which Barth very clearly rejects. He maintains a very sharp creator-creature distinction. We must become imitators of Christ. I think one of the difficult realities of apocalypticism is the recognition that Paul evidently believes that the state of celibacy is superior to the state of marriage.
Yes.
I don't think we can easily jettison that doctrine.
No.
I think we have to maintain a place for it, to say that your life will be more conformed to the ascetical death to the self by being chaste your entire life. This is not something that we do. Celibacy is a gift that God gives to some people. And I would say that, keeping that in mind, given then that most people don't have the gift of celibacy, I think a normative ethics would create room for dialogue between more radical progressive Christians who do find things like sex outside of marriage and polyamory to be acceptable in light of the gospel, and those who, while still being affirming, don't think that. I think there has to be room for dialogue between those two groups. And it's funny to me that we're having this conversation because it's so niche. Like we're talking about like the group of the circle of affirming Christians and the circle of even more radical affirming Christians. Like we're not talking about the vast majority of people who want to stone queer people to death.
Actually, that was a question I was going to ask earlier, and this might be a time to mention it, is also what do we do in the light of, like, as we're seeing right now with the Roe v. Wade decision, as we see with the trans legislation, like, pulling this into our historical context now, the direction of history seems to be currently a reaction against queerness and against, bodily autonomy, whatever. So I think still fitting with the kind of the question of a Christological normative sex ethic, to make it broader and not just in our insular little world here. What is our ethic? What are we called to do? What is an apocalyptic image of what we're supposed to do? So both for how we think about our own desires and our own, or sexuality, but then also how do we fight for against such repressive systems or whatever within the church.
I think this is where we need to bring in the imminent critique of people like Lee Edelman, where we have a critique of what he calls reproductive futurity, which is the notion that the future tense is the primary mode of articulation of our present temporality. Well, what does all that jargon mean?
Yeah.
Comes up with the idea of the figural child. And what is the figural child except this image of a child that has to be appealed to in every sort of political discourse. And the funny thing is that the discourse appears to be extra political. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Funnily enough, in the 90s, pro-choice advocates appealed to the quality of life of future children to justify abortion practices, which I think is darkly humorous to me.
Yeah.
This argument comes up in books like Freakonomics and Super Freakonomics, which basically talk about
I remember those. Yeah.
How you remember how we need to have abortion to increase quality of life for future generations. To me, this is a really shitty argument for pro-choice law.
It's eugenics. I mean, the Freakonomics one is pretty distinctly that, I recall, because it's like, places that have legalized abortion have lower crime rates within a few decades. It's like, oh man.
Terrible.
Yeah.
I think we have to, I'm not going to go on the trajectory of giving a logic for why I support the pro-choice position. I think that's another episode altogether. But I think getting to a place where we recognize the autonomy of an individual person as its own thing in and of itself, and not appealing to this imaginary child, this spectral image, which is used by the right wing to justify stripping away human rights protections against queer people and people of color.
This actually ties really well into it hasn't been released yet, but the episode that's going to come right before this one, we talk about the culture war, and one of the final statements that my guest makes is that neither side of the political aisle actually seems to actually care about children in current American politics, because among a lot of bourgeois liberal or even a lot of more like radical family abolitionist stuff, there's a really anti-natalist viewpoint that kind of floats around, calling, women who have children breeders and stuff like that. As you have like then in like the right wing, there is what you're kind of talking about, this appeal to this ideal child. However, in practice, you talk about like the anti-trans legislation that's going on right now. What is that if not criminalizing children in schools who decide to not conform? Going after parents who choose to affirm their child in new identities. It is deeply anti-family, but we've allowed the right to take on a lot of those talking points in a way that is really troubling. But yeah, so almost like an abolition of this idealized child, and I mean, to be a bit of a Marxist, almost a concern for actual children as they currently exist.
I think once we begin to disestablish the social conditions of heteronormativity, that will be part of a broader anti-capitalist struggle, which, in my opinion, is part of the responsibility of the church.
Yes.
The church needs to fight an intersectional struggle, not only against the forces of racism and homophobia and transphobia, but also against capital as well. Mm-hmm. And this is a intersectional struggle, I think, that needs to be actualized, and through coalition building, through activism, and I'm going to, even though I don't necessarily have very much optimism in the present moment, through legislation.
Yeah.
And the current milieu that we're living in really harkens back to a kind of politicized nostalgia. Lauren Berlant, one of my favorite theorists who passed away recently, wrote a book called Cruel Optimism. And in the book, she argues that a cruel optimism is a set or a constellation of affects which a certain person believes will bring them salvation, but in actuality ends up killing the person. And someone says, what's an example of a cruel optimism? The American dream is a cruel optimism.
Yeah.
We think that by having 2 jobs and doing the whole Sigma grind set and side hustling and all this thing, we'll have a state that ends up giving us social welfare in our old age. Social security is crumbling.
Yeah.
The likelihood of us, of our generation, having meaningful social security is dwindling by the day. Mm-hmm. While we're spending trillions of dollars on massacring brown people in countries that nobody even knows exist.
Right.
It's not a good situation. And ultimately, what we're seeing now is a politics of disidentification. And this is the term that Jose Esteban Munoz uses in Cruising Utopias, which is basically, and the way I'm reappropriating the word is enough to say that it's easier to believe in these nostalgic fictions of a 1950s white supremacist racial past where people lived in these suburbs and exurbs where, everyone has a nice house, 2 bedrooms, nice car, 2.5 kids, and a golden retriever.
Right.
This image is so burned into the American psyche that we pursue it relentlessly at the expense of our own health and well-being. And it's not coming. It's not going to be there. It's a cruel optimism. And it's a national, it's almost psychoanalytic, really. It's a libidinal investment of faith in this system. And so you ask me, how do we make sense out of these reactionary legislations? I think part of it is the disidentification with the material conditions of our moment. It's not being able to process the reality of exploitation, of post-colonialism, of global flows of capital, and instead retreating to certain constellations of ideology that provide a sense of comfort. So the American dream conspiracy theories, various narratives of Gnostic religion that say, the Left Behind kind of stories of rapture theology, right? I think all of these things are connected into a broader network of ideology that helps people deal and cope with the broadly incoherent streams of neoliberal late capitalism, as Frederick Jameson would call it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you mentioned Jameson. I was thinking here also of like Mark Fisher, just like kind of an inability to imagine a future and kind of retreating backward into past images. And you see this on aspects of the left as well, where you kind of like romanticize the USSR in certain aspects or something like that, rather than being, able to imagine something new, moving towards something imaginative. So there's an aspect of this that like we need a form of cultural imagination, and it's disappointing that the church, which in theory, with its tradition of prophetic imagination, to kind of reference Brueggemann there, like isn't taking on that role. And you mentioned that these things are all tied together. We talk about queerness, we talk about capitalism, resisting. All of those things goes together in an intersectional sense. And the mainline church, speaking of our home here, is interested in the inclusion of queer people to an extent, which is great. But it is definitely not interested in challenging capitalism, or not many. And not and I don't mean to attack my co-religionists too much here, but it's definitely not not at the forefront of concern, especially as the Episcopal Church is kind of run like a giant nonprofit in just how it's structured. What do you think the average Episcopalian, average mainliner should be doing within their church, if there's anything they can do to, I guess, push the church toward this imaginative, anti-capitalist prophetic role?
One of my friends on Twitter, who goes by the handle Henry Wallace,
friend of the show,
really brought me to avoid this kind of existential nihilism, existential pessimism, who, this perspective that you get with Emile Cioran and Pessoa, which I really, find a home in as a, aspiring French intellectual.
Yeah.
What do we do? What do we do when we don't want to be in the heights of despair? I think the ideology of the Situationist International and 20th century French political activism has really been an inspiration to me. The theories of Tikkun and the cybernetic the cybernetic hypothesis, or the the Civil War, introduction to Civil War, and all this kind of stuff. Basically, we can't dismantle capitalism in the way that Slavoj Žižek wants it to happen.
Okay.
There's not going to be a vanguard party. There's not going to be this Jacobin-style social democrat, what have you. Forms of capital are too diffuse. Institutions are falling apart. Society is crumbling. Debord, already in the 60s, talked about the society of the spectacle.
Yeah.
Baudrillard,
very prophetic, yeah.
Tell me about it. Baudrillard Baudrillard passed away, but was talking about, fragments and fractals. He talks about fractal strategies, right? I think coalition building and community building by the church, and for the world is the future. What does that look like? I think people who have the discretionary spending, people who have the money to live cooperatively should do it. What that means is living life in accordance as much as possible with the Book of Acts. Multi-generational homes, communal infrastructure, running for local office to gain influence. These are all positions that have been clearly articulated by Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau. Basically, working at the local level to make sure that when catastrophe strikes, people who are unhoused in your area have a place to go.
This is really on topic with a lot of conversations I've had on the show, and so it's kind of amazing you are repeating the same thing. I a few episodes back had on a friend of mine who's an anarchist organizer here in Des Moines. This is exactly what he was saying as well. Even though he's not a religious person, but he's thinking about taking it as a given that there will be crisis in the next couple decades because of the ecological situation, because of the contradictions of capital, whatever, what have you. And it's more about, we got to start building communities now that will withstand the collapse. And I was going to say he's a very different thinker than the ones you're pulling up, but I thought of Alistair McIntyre pretty immediately there as well. The now cliched line of we're waiting on a doubtless very different Saint Benedict, right? The building of communities, and in his case he's talking about religious communities, but they don't necessarily have to be, although I think that spiritual transcendent aspect is important. Essentially taking it as a given this thing's about to cave in, and that we can try to build a better world on the ashes of the old.
It's that prophetic voice of the church that's coming in to give us a motivation to work towards social and ecological justice. A lot of my friends on the left ask me, why do you insist on this religious framework? And I think part of the reason is, and again, this is a really shitty argument, and I don't expect anyone to be convinced by it.
It's a personal one.
It's a personal argument. It's just that I don't have any inspiration otherwise. That if I don't have this apocalyptic prophetic voice in my head that says a new order has dawned and a new order is dawning, I'm going to stick with Emil Chiron and Pessoa. I'm going to stay and...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, good.
I was going to say, I was going to relish on the heights of despair. I'm going to relish in my own excrement.
Yeah. There is a craving for the transcendent that's really necessary, I think, to any sort of political struggle. And I would say, like, I was moving back toward Christianity for a while, but really one of the things that spiked my real return was actually the 2020 protests here, the Black Lives Matter ones. There was something incredibly religious to me about that experience, being in a community of people resisting the state. And I think that's not maybe the case for everybody, but there's a sense of hope that, like, I think it's kind of interesting. I understand why Fisher never got into religion too much with his writing, but I'd love to put Walter Brueggemann and him in conversation, because near the end of his life, Fisher was going toward like psychedelics and stuff like that as a form of a concept of the transcendent or the imagination or whatever. As several decades earlier, Brueggemann was writing the prophetic imagination. He was writing about religion as this source of taking these maybe old images or discourses and renewing them and using them to imagine something forward. So yeah, I think of that religious aspect. I've been on a kick of watching a lot of like late Soviet film, just started from binging some like Tarkovsky movies, but moving out. And there's a real theme of the collapse of the Soviet Union and this craving for this transcendent other that feels really in line with now, at least how I feel now. Because a lot of the last couple Tarkovsky movies, think of Stalker, Nostalgia, and The Sacrifice, are all these films of a very desolate and stagnant world, and this craving toward almost an irrational act of faith. And the Polish film Obi Oba, The End of Civilization, similarly ends where it's very clearly the end of the world, nuclear holocaust, and yet there's this seeming belief in a myth that they even invented, that still somehow transcends reality, even though they know that they lied and made it up. And even Come and See, I would argue, has a transcendent ending, because as he shoots this portrait of Hitler, it starts to reverse history. You see like these reversed. There's a belief that somehow all the crimes of the past can be undone, and to me, nothing points to a Christocentric worldview than that. This belief that somehow all the sins of history can still be rectified. And so, yeah, I think it's this transcendent thing really feels my leftism, And I think that even if I don't think everybody's going to become a Christian on the left, and I don't expect that to happen or necessarily want that to happen, I do think you need to have that feeling of transcendence, or because it guides this. Yeah.
One of the not frequently commented upon dimensions of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's thought is the redemption of memory itself.
Oh wow, yeah.
So you mentioned Stalker, the 1979 Tarkovsky film, and I thought about the idea of the zone, where it shows you what you desire, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there is something terrifying about being shown what we don't know that we desire. And I think in the redemption of our memories, we won't have that fear anymore. That the desires that we think we have, which keep us up at night, will be redeemed in the second parousia of Jesus. And that's one of my transcendental motivating beliefs.
Yeah. I guess so this conversation we're having here now, kind of broadly about kind of an apocalyptic politics. I know how we got here from queer theory, but I think it would be interesting to try to tie them back together before we kind of wrap up. And so, how does this battle against queer theory or whatever fit in with this apocalyptic vision and this imagining a new world?
Fundamentally, what I think it's doing is saying that the realm of sociality, the very order of being that we understand today, is rotten. It's rotten to the core. It replicates and reduplicates systems of oppression, alienation, and estrangement that are bad not only for queer people, but for people who identify with normative sexualities and genders as well. I think it creates expectations of performance that make people miserable. I think a Christianity that is truly liberating can take not only the insights of queer theory, but the insights of Foucault as well, and these historicist insights, by dismantling these transcendental historical a prioris and ultimately viewing our historical situation today as ultimately contingent and based on a series of factors that are largely out of our control and are largely rooted in questions of an economization of the libidinal economy, where we become slaves to capital, we become commodities, and this exchange of roles between an authentic organic solidarity is exchanged, as Debord says, for a commodity fetishism, this kind of circulation of media signs. We live in this simulated reality that Baudrillard says is a simulacrum. And I think returning to organic solidarity, organic sociality, to avoid becoming fascism needs to be needs to be rooted in an intersectional struggle for the oppressed, for the marginalized. And I think we do that. Oh, sorry.
No, you're good.
I thought I had turned off Do Not Disturb. Sorry.
No, good.
The way we do that is by this kind of local grassroots struggle.
Yeah, I'm thinking of the David Graeber quote that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something we make and could just as easily make differently. And so, in a way, you're saying that mentality lines up with a Christian vision. Is that the world can be something other than what it currently is. It's not a given, and that's what the apocalyptic vision of Christianity suggests. Well, I think that does a good job of kind of wrapping up this conversation here. So I don't know. Is there anything else you would like to say?
Nope.
Great.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for coming on. This has been a fantastic conversation. I guess before we head out, where can people follow you on social media? Is there anything that you're working on that you'd like to plug?
I have a new podcast called "Explain Things to Me," which you
Very
can
good.
find on my Twitter at Woe2Chorzin.
Okay. And I'll have a link to both of those, your Twitter and that, in the description for everybody. And yeah, thank you everybody for listening.